Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications because the stories you're about to hear are unusual, and some of them may stay with you long after the video ends. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I want to know how far these stories are going. The winter of 1974 in Amityville seemed harsher than usual. The cold wasn't limited to the biting air that swept through the silent streets of Long Island, but seemed to emanate from the very walls of the houses, as if something invisible were ingrained in the town. The residence on Ocean Avenue, with its seemingly ordinary facade, held a weight that few could explain, but many felt. The house was large, imposing, with windows that seemed to watch passers-by. During the day, it looked like just another upper-middle-class property. At night, however, it became something else. There was something about the way darkness gathered around it, too dense, as if the light had difficulty remaining there. Inside that house, the DeFeo family led a seemingly ordinary routine. Ronald DeFeo Sr. was a rigid man, accustomed to absolute control within the home. His presence dominated the rooms, often more through silence than words. His wife, Louise, maintained a submissive, almost inconspicuous posture, as if she had learned not to take up space. The children grew up under this constant tension. Among them, Ronald DeFeo Jr., the eldest, carried something that no one could clearly define. His behavior was erratic, oscillating between moments of apparent normality and silent outbursts of contained anger. He observed more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his words rarely revealed what he truly thought. The house seemed to react to this dynamic. Doors creaked for no apparent reason. Footsteps echoed at impossible hours. The plumbing vibrated as if something were trapped inside the walls, small details that individually could be ignored, but together they formed a disturbing pattern. One night, Ronald Jr. stayed awake longer than usual. He walked through the house with slow, almost calculated steps, as if he were following something only he could perceive. He stopped before the main staircase and stood motionless, staring at the upper floor. His eyes were fixed, but he didn't seem to be looking at a specific place. It was as if he were listening. The silence in the house wasn't complete. There was a sound, low, constant, almost imperceptible, a whisper that didn't come from a specific direction. It wasn't a clear voice, but a sonic presence, something that shouldn't be there. Ronald clenched his fists. His breathing became irregular. For a brief moment, he seemed to hesitate, but then something changed in his expression. The doubt vanished, replaced by utter coldness. The following morning, the town would awaken to news that would resonate far beyond Amityville. 6 members of the DeFeo family were found dead inside the house, everyone in their beds, no signs of a struggle, no escape attempts, as if something had prevented any reaction. The scene was disturbing not only because of the violence, but because of the strange organization. The bodies were lined up as if they had been positioned there. There was no disorder, no chaos, only silence. Ronald DeFeo Jr. was later found visibly shaken, but not injured. His initial account was confused and fragmented. He spoke of voices, of something watching him, of a presence that wouldn't leave him alone. Police initially treated the case as a brutal but explainable crime. However, as details emerged, some questions began to trouble even the most experienced investigators. How could 6 people be killed without any of them reacting? Why didn't anyone hear gunshots during the night? And, most unsettling of all, why did Ronald Jr. seem, at certain times, more relieved than traumatized? The house on Ocean Avenue was no longer just a crime scene. She had become an enigma, and for some, something far worse. After the discovery of the bodies, Amityville ceased to be just a quiet suburban town and became the center of uncomfortable attention. Police cars parked for days, journalists circulating the streets, and curious onlookers trying to get close to the house transformed the atmosphere into something heavy, almost suffocating. Even so, there was a collective feeling that this was not just another crime. There was something that no one could name, but that everyone avoided confronting directly. The investigation progressed based on concrete facts, but constantly stumbled upon details that didn't fit. The weapon used, a rifle, produced a sound loud enough to wake anyone in the house, and even nearby neighbors. However, no consistent reports of gunshots were registered that night. Some residents said they heard something in the distance. Others claimed to have noticed absolutely nothing. It was as if the environment itself had absorbed the sound. Ronald DeFeo Jr. came under closer scrutiny. His behavior during interrogations did not follow an expected pattern. At times, he seemed genuinely lost, like someone trying to piece together fragments of memory that didn't make sense. At other times, he displayed a disturbing calm, answering objectively, almost too coldly for someone who had lost his entire family. Investigators began to reconstruct the household routine before the tragedy. Accounts from acquaintances indicated that the family environment was tense, marked by constant conflict. The father, authoritarian, maintained rigid control over everyone. Minor mistakes were dealt with harshly. The children, in turn, developed distinct behaviors to cope with this. Some became more withdrawn, others more unstable. Ronald Jr., however, was an exception. He didn't just react to the pressure, he seemed to absorb it more deeply. There were records of abrupt mood swings, episodes of isolation, and a growing difficulty in maintaining a stable routine. Friends mentioned that he occasionally spoke about strange sensations within the house, not as something clearly supernatural, but as a constant presence that left him uneasy. The residence itself began to draw attention as part of the problem. Built in an area that, according to historical records, had already been occupied by different structures over the years, the property carried a fragmented history. There was no concrete evidence of previous violent events, but there were scattered accounts from former residents who mentioned persistent discomfort, sleepless nights, and a constant feeling of being watched. These accounts, initially ignored, began to be reconsidered as the case progressed. Not as evidence, but as an element that increased the complexity of the situation. During the investigation, one specific point began to draw attention: the victims' lack of resistance. They were all found in similar positions, as if they were fast asleep. There were no signs of struggle, nor attempts to escape. This raised two equally unsettling possibilities. Either they were incapacitated in some way, or they simply didn't perceive the danger. This second hypothesis was the most difficult to accept. Faced with this information, Ronald Jr. began to alter his narrative. His answers started to include less concrete elements. He mentioned voices, not constant, but recurring. He didn't say exactly what they were ordering, but he implied that there was an external influence on his actions. The investigators maintained a skeptical stance. The official line remained focused on human motivations, family conflicts, possible substance use, emotional instability, all within an understandable framework. Still, the details remained mismatched, like pieces of a puzzle that almost fit together, but always left a small gap. Meanwhile, the house remained isolated, surrounded by security tape. Even empty, it seemed to carry a heavy presence. Police officers reported discomfort when remaining in the place for long periods. Some avoided being alone inside. Others mentioned subtle noises, footsteps, creaks, vibrations, always without a clear origin. Nothing that could be officially recorded as evidence, but enough to fuel a growing unease. The media began to explore these nuances, albeit cautiously. The case was already shocking in itself, but the inexplicable elements added a layer that attracted even more attention. The narrative ceased to be solely about a brutal crime and began to flirt with something darker. Ronald DeFeo Jr. became the center of attention, not just as a suspect, but as a piece that didn't seem to fit completely into any explanation. His posture, his changes in behavior, and especially his fragmented statements kept the doubt alive. Was he a murderer? A victim of something bigger? Or is someone trying to hide an even more disturbing truth? The city watched. The investigation progressed, but the feeling persisted. There was something in that story that had not yet been revealed. And maybe, if it weren't something that could be easily explained. As the days went by, the investigation ceased to be merely a technical process and became a game of escalating tension. Each new piece of information seemed to raise more questions than it answered, and the case began to put pressure not only on those directly involved, but also on those responsible for finding a logical explanation for what had happened inside the house. Ronald DeFeo Jr. was no longer just a confused witness. He was becoming the main focus. The inconsistencies in his accounts began to accumulate in a way that was impossible to ignore. At one moment, he claimed that family members had been killed by an unknown intruder. At another, he said he didn't remember crucial details of the night. And then, almost seamlessly, he would mention the voices again. The investigators began to confront him more firmly. Photographs of the scene, reconstructed timelines, ballistic analyses, everything was presented methodically, attempting to break down any psychological resistance. The pressure increased with each session, and, little by little, something began to give way. But not in the way expected. Instead of a direct confession, Ronald delved into increasingly disconcerting narratives. He described the night as if he were torn between action and observation. At times, he spoke as if he were carrying out the acts. At others, as if he were watching everything unfold, unable to interfere. This duality deeply troubled the investigators, not only because of its strangeness, but also because of the difficulty in separating strategy from a possible mental disorder. Meanwhile, the forensic reports added new layers to the mystery. The precision of the shots indicated control. There were no signs of hesitation. Each shot seemed calculated. This directly contradicted the image of someone completely dominated by impulses or hallucinations. It was as if two versions of Ronald coexisted, one disorganized, fragmented, and the other extremely cold and efficient. The timeline of the night of the crime was also beginning to take on more defined and more disturbing contours. The time suggested that the murders occurred in sequence, without long intervals. Yet, none of the victims reacted in any meaningful way. Investigators tested hypotheses, sedation, prior manipulation, even complicity from someone inside the house. None of them held up completely. There was no clear evidence of drugs in the victims' systems. There were no signs of struggle or restraint. And above all, there was no indication of the involvement of another person. Ronald was alone. And yet nothing seemed simple. During one of the most intense interrogations, he finally broke down, not explosively but gradually. His posture changed. His gaze, previously erratic, became fixed. His breathing slowed. And then he said almost mechanically, "They weren't going to wake up." The sentence hung in the air. When pressed to explain, he didn't go into technical details. Instead, he returned to the same point. The voices, he said they knew, that they told him when to act, that they guaranteed no one would react. The investigators exchanged glances. That wasn't an explanation. It was a diversion. But at the same time, there was something in that statement that disturbingly fit the facts. The investigation then took a new turn, to understand not only what happened, but how it was possible. Meanwhile, outside the interrogation room, external pressure was mounting. The media was already treating the case as one of the strangest of the decade. Experts were being called in to give their opinions. Criminologists, psychiatrists, even figures who addressed unexplained phenomena. Each one presented a theory. None of them completely closed the case. Inside the house, a new inspection was carried out, this time more detailed, more careful. Each room was analyzed not only as part of a crime scene, but as a possible influencing factor. And it was at that moment that small details began to bother us even more. Subtle marks on the walls, almost imperceptible unevenness in the floor, areas where the air seemed colder, even without a structural explanation. None of this was enough to be considered proof, but it contributed to a growing feeling that the environment was not neutral. It was as if the house wasn't just a setting, but an active part of what happened. The investigation team, despite maintaining a rational stance, began working under a different kind of tension. It wasn't outright fear, but a constant unease. Staying inside the house for too long became uncomfortable. The silence there was unusual. It was heavy, almost oppressive, and this began to affect even the most skeptical. Ronald, for his part, seemed to oscillate between two states. At times, he displayed superficial, almost automatic remorse. At other times, there was a complete void, an absence of emotion that made any attempt at psychological analysis even more difficult. The central question was no longer just, why did he do it? Yes, what really happened inside that house that night? And even more unsettling, to what extent was Ronald DeFeo Jr. in control? The research progressed, but with each step the feeling was the same. They were approaching something, but they didn't know if they were ready to understand. While the main focus remained on Ronald DeFeo Jr. and the reconstruction of the night of the murders, other layers began to emerge, further amplifying the complexity of the case. Small details, previously considered peripheral, began to connect in a disturbing way, forming a network of possibilities that made any simple explanation seem increasingly distant. One of these layers involved the family's financial history. Parallel investigations revealed a significant life insurance policy covering the members of the household. This raised a straightforward and logical hypothesis: financial motivation. However, this line of inquiry quickly encountered obstacles. Ronald's behavior before and after the crime did not indicate planning aimed at financial gain. There were no suspicious transactions, nor clear attempts to claim any money. If money was a factor, it was far from the only one, or even the main one. Another subplot began to gain traction from outside accounts. Neighbors and acquaintances, initially cautious, began to share experiences they had previously avoided mentioning. One reported seeing lights on at unusual hours inside the house, even when the family was supposedly asleep. Another mentioned sounds coming from the basement, not typical structural noises, but something more erratic, like intermittent knocking. These accounts, though subjective, began to repeat themselves with slight variations. None was conclusive in isolation, but together they created a pattern that was difficult to ignore. The basement, incidentally, became a point of growing interest. During the initial investigations, it had been treated as just another space in the house. Now, it is being analyzed more closely. It was a damp environment, with poor lighting and a layout that made it difficult to fully perceive the space. There were areas partially hidden by old structures, creating natural blind spots. Nothing concrete was found there, but the feeling reported by those who entered the place was always the same: immediate discomfort. Meanwhile, questions arose about Ronald's mental health. Experts were consulted, and their analyses varied significantly. Some pointed to possible serious psychological disorders, capable of explaining both the behavior and the narratives about voices. Others, however, highlighted the inconsistency of these symptoms. The alternation between disorganization and extreme precision did not fit neatly into a single diagnosis. This divergence created a new tension within the case. To what extent was Ronald responsible for his actions? And to what extent could he be using these narratives as a form of manipulation? Meanwhile, the media began to explore these multiple layers more aggressively. Television programs, newspapers, and magazines began to treat the case not just as a crime, but as a phenomenon, Terms like inexplicable, disturbing, and beyond comprehension became common in headlines. This exhibition brought new figures to the center of the story. Among them were people interested in phenomena that defied conventional explanation. Some claimed that the house might be located at an unusual energy point. Others suggested that past events, not officially documented, might have left a mark on the site. These theories, although rejected by official investigations, began to influence public perception, and, in a way, they also affected the environment surrounding the case. Within the investigative team, the pressure was mounting, not only because of the need to conclude the case, but also because of the growing feeling that they were dealing with something that didn't behave like a common crime. With each new analysis, small inconsistencies emerged. Nothing significant enough to invalidate the main hypothesis, but enough to prevent a completely satisfactory conclusion. Ronald, for his part, began to show more subtle changes. He spoke less, but observed more. His silences became longer, more intense. When questioned directly, he answered objectively, but avoided going into details, especially when the subject involved the night of the crime. At one particular moment, during a break in one of the interrogations, he asked one of the investigators an unexpected question. "Have you guys ever stayed there at night?" The question was not answered, but it was recorded. Because it didn't seem like a provocation. It seemed like a warning. This simple phrase began to resonate among those involved in the case. Some started to reconsider their experience inside the house from a new perspective. Others further reinforced their rational stance, rejecting any deviation that could not be proven. This division, although silent, created internal tension, and time was beginning to become a critical factor. The pressure for answers mounted, while the margin for error dwindled. Every decision needed to be precise, every conclusion well-founded. However, the deeper they delved, the more the sense of control slipped away. The subplots, financial, psychological, environmental, did not compete with each other. They overlapped, and together they formed something much more difficult to decipher. The house, empty and isolated, remained at the center of everything, silent, but never neutral. The investigation was already dragging on, under increasing pressure, when a new element emerged, not as an isolated piece, but as something capable of completely altering the course of the case. Until then, everything revolved around Ronald DeFeo Jr., his contradictions, his possible instability, and the unusual circumstances of the night of the murders. But there was something that had not yet been explored in sufficient depth. What happened inside the house in the hours immediately preceding the crime? A thorough reassessment of the timeline was initiated, this time with a different focus, not just on objective events, but on the intervals, the silences, the spaces between events. It was in this process that an almost imperceptible, yet significant discrepancy emerged. The timings indicated that Ronald stayed awake longer than he had initially stated. Small details, lights seen on, movement inside, indirect accounts, suggested that he was not only active, but was constantly moving around the house during the early morning hours. That, in itself, was not enough to change the course of the investigation. But what came next was, during a follow-up inspection of the house, conducted outside of standard hours, one of the investigators decided to stay longer than necessary. There was no specific reason, simply the need to observe the environment under conditions more similar to those of the night of the crime. The rest of the team had already left. The house was completely silent. That's when something happened. Not explicitly, not in a way that could be recorded as concrete evidence, but enough to provoke an immediate reaction, a sound, not loud, not clear. A subtle displacement, as if something had moved in a part of the house where there shouldn't be any activity. The investigator walked through the rooms, checking doors, windows, and structures. Nothing. But upon returning to the main corridor, he noticed something that hadn't been there before. A door ajar. It was the access to the basement. He was certain it was closed. The descent was slow. Each step seemed to amplify the weight of the surroundings. The air, already naturally cold, felt even denser. The dim lighting created shadows that didn't remain static, as if responding to movement, but with a subtle delay. Upon reaching the last step, the silence was broken by a low sound, rhythmic, almost like breathing. The investigator took a few steps forward, trying to locate the source. The sound wasn't coming from a fixed point. It seemed to be moving, or perhaps reflecting off the walls in an irregular way, and then it stopped, abruptly. The silence that followed was unusual. It was absolute. He left the place immediately. In the official report, none of this was included. Just a generic observation about structural verification without relevant anomalies. But outside the document, the impact was real. The experience was shared informally with other team members, and although no one openly admitted it, it altered the internal perception of the case. Shortly after, Ronald DeFeo Jr. was questioned again, this time with a different approach. Without direct confrontations, no immediate pressure. The strategy was to allow him to drive part of the narrative, and it worked. After a long period of silence, he began to speak. Not about the crime itself, but about the house. He described recurring sensations, not just on the night of the murders, but in the weeks before. He spoke of specific points where the atmosphere seemed heavier, of moments when the silence became too uncomfortable to remain still, of the constant feeling that he was not alone, even when the house was empty. When questioned directly about the basement, his reaction was immediate. For the first time, there was a clear change. His body stiffened, his gaze shifted, and for a few seconds he didn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, lower, more controlled. "It didn't start that night." The phrase marked an irreversible turning point in the investigation. Until then, everything was treated as the consequence of an isolated event, a brutal crime with unusual circumstances. Now the possibility of continuity arose, from something that developed over time, something that wasn't limited to a single night. Even while maintaining a rational stance, the investigators could not ignore the impact of this change. The narrative was no longer linear. The focus was no longer just on the act itself, but on the process that led up to it. And that opened up a new path, a more uncertain path, more difficult to control. The house, which was already seen as a significant setting, began to be considered from a new perspective, not just as a place where something happened, but as a factor that may have directly influenced what happened. The turning point brought no answers. I brought something even more unsettling. The realization that perhaps the initial question was wrong. Perhaps it wasn't just, why did Ronald do that? Yes, what exactly began before that night? The impact of the turning point wasn't immediate in the public sphere, but internally everything changed. The investigation stopped following a single line and began operating on two parallel fronts, one supported by concrete evidence aimed at directly holding Ronald DeFeo Jr. accountable, and another, quieter, almost unofficial, that attempted to understand the elements that didn't fit within a conventional explanation. This division began to affect the team's decisions. Reports became more objective, avoiding any mention of subjective experiences. At the same time, off-the-record conversations gained more space, discreet exchanges between investigators who, even without admitting it, began to consider that the case could not be reduced to just an isolated act of violence. Ronald, for his part, reacted subtly to this change in approach. He seemed to perceive when he was being analyzed merely as a suspect, and when there was something more being considered. On those occasions, his posture changed. He became less defensive, almost cooperative, but only up to a point. He never gave everything away. There was always a limit. The interrogation sessions began to reveal a disturbing pattern. Ronald spoke more when not directly pressured. And the content of these statements rarely revolved around the crime itself. He described altered routines, sleepless nights, moments when he avoided certain rooms in the house without knowing exactly why. These statements, though vague, began to form a continuous line, a kind of progression of unease that preceded the murders. Meanwhile, external pressure reached a new level. The media no longer treated the case merely as a shocking crime, but as a national enigma. Television programs explored every detail, experts publicly disagreed, and the public began to divide between rational explanations and more obscure interpretations. This exposure had direct consequences. The house, even though isolated, began to attract constant attention. People approached, some out of curiosity, others driven by more specific interests. Reports began to emerge. Visitors who said they felt unwell when approaching, who avoided looking directly at certain windows, who stayed for only a few minutes before leaving. None of this was officially validated, but it didn't stop either. Within the research, a new problem arose: burnout. The team, faced with a case that wasn't progressing conclusively, began to show signs of fatigue. Small errors started to appear. Decisions were revised more frequently. The feeling of control diminished. And with that came the need to close. The main line of investigation was strengthened. The material evidence was clear enough to support a direct accusation. Ronald DeFeo, Jr. had access to the weapon, was present in the house. His accounts were inconsistent, and at one point he had admitted involvement. It was the most solid path, safer, more acceptable, but it wasn't complete. This gap was officially ignored, not due to a lack of awareness, but due to a lack of feasibility. There was no way to transform feelings, indirect accounts, and subjective experiences into concrete proof. The decision has been made. The case would proceed based on what could be proven. Ronald was formally charged. His reaction was not explosive. There was no intense denial nor a desperate attempt at defense at that moment. He simply observed in silence, as if he already knew that this outcome was inevitable or perhaps irrelevant in the face of something greater. In the following days, his behavior became even more restrained. He spoke only when necessary. He avoided prolonged eye contact. But on isolated occasions, he still let slip small phrases that didn't fit the legal context. Fragments, indirect references, always incomplete. Meanwhile, the house remained empty, but not forgotten. Even as the process progressed, she remained present in conversations, internal reports, and unresolved questions. Some investigators avoided returning to the site. Others argued that new analyses should be conducted. None of these initiatives moved forward. The focus needed to be maintained. The case needed to be closed, and so it was conducted. But the consequences were not limited to the legal process. They stayed, in the form of unanswered questions. It felt like something had been left behind. And most importantly, in the silent certainty that even with an official response, not everything had really been explained. The progress of the legal process brought an appearance of order to the chaos, but behind the formal decisions, a more subtle movement was taking place, not only within Ronald DeFeo Jr., but also within those who were directly or indirectly affected by the case. The story ceased to be solely about what happened inside the house, and began to reflect the lasting impact it had. For Ronald, the controlled environment of prison represented a complete break with everything he had experienced. His home was gone, as were the spaces he avoided, and the places where he said he felt something different. Yet, the absence of these elements did not bring immediate relief. On the contrary, in the first few days, his behavior indicated a constant attempt to adapt, as if he were recalibrating his own perception of reality. Without the stimuli he associated with the house, all that remained was himself, and that seemed to be more difficult than any external confrontation. Initially, Ronald maintained the same pattern: short answers, little interaction, constant observation. But over time, small changes began to emerge. They weren't obvious transformations nor linear progress. They were almost imperceptible adjustments. Longer pauses before responding, moments of silence that no longer seemed charged with tension but with reflection. The professionals responsible for evaluating him began to observe these changes cautiously. There was no consensus on what they represented. For some, it was merely a natural adaptation to the environment. For others, there was an indication of something deeper, an attempt, albeit fragmented, to understand his own actions. During one of the sessions, when questioned about the night of the murders, Ronald did not immediately resort to the voices. Instead, he remained silent for a considerable time. When he finally spoke, his response offered no justifications or external explanations. "I knew what I was doing." The phrase marked a rupture. It did not eliminate previous contradictions, nor did it resolve the inexplicable elements, but it indicated an important shift. For the first time, there was a direct admission of awareness. This did not mean redemption, but it pointed to the beginning of accountability. At the same time, outside the prison environment, other individuals were also affected by this process. Investigators who followed the case began to revisit their own conclusions. Some reinforced their confidence in the rational explanation, a crime motivated by internal conflicts, aggravated by psychological instability. Others, however, maintained reservations. These differences did not generate open confrontations, but created an invisible line between interpretations, and that trend persisted. The house, still unoccupied, continued to exert a silent influence. Even without new concrete events, it remained a point of reference, not only physical, but symbolic. It represented everything that had not been completely resolved. As time passed, new people began to take an interest in the place. Some saw it only as a property with a tragic past. Others saw something more, an opportunity to understand what had been left unresolved. This interest was not uniform, but it was constant. For Ronald, however, this external world was becoming increasingly distant. His reality was restricted to controlled routines, set schedules, and limited interactions. Within this context, his transformation did not follow a clear path of overcoming challenges, but rather one of internal confrontation. He began to avoid talking about external elements, voices, sensations, influences. When he did, it was vaguely, almost as if he were describing something that no longer held the same weight. In contrast, when he spoke about himself, there was more consistency, more clarity, but also more silence. This process did not lead to a complete resolution. There was no definitive moment of total understanding, nor a final explanation that reorganized all the events. Ronald's growth was limited, fragmented, and, in many respects, insufficient to answer the central questions of the case. Still, there was a change. He ceased to be merely a figure shrouded in mystery and became also someone confronting his own actions, even if incompletely. And perhaps that was the most uncomfortable point of all, because by assuming part of the responsibility, he did not eliminate the inexplicable. It only made it even harder to ignore. The story was moving towards its formal conclusion. But what really mattered was no longer just the proven facts. It was in that which remained unanswered, and each person chose to believe what really happened inside that house. As the trial approached, the narrative built throughout the investigation began to solidify, not necessarily as the absolute truth, but as the most legally sustainable version. Every detail needed to be organized, every inconsistency smoothed out or reinterpreted. The goal was no longer to understand everything, but to present something coherent enough to be accepted. The prosecution structured its line of accusation based on solid facts. Ronald's presence in the house, access to the weapon, inconsistencies in his accounts, and most importantly, the absence of any concrete evidence to support the involvement of third parties. It was a straightforward, rational, and objective construction. On the other side, the defense was preparing a more complex strategy. It didn't completely deny the facts, but sought to weaken the idea of Ronald's total control. His emotional instability, fragmented accounts, and atypical behavior were presented as indications that something was out of the ordinary. It wasn't a matter of innocence, but of partial responsibility. This duality created increasing tension. The case was no longer just about what happened, and then it became a matter of how that would be interpreted. While the lawyers refined their arguments, some investigators revisited specific points of the investigation, not out of procedural requirement, but out of personal unease. Small details still remained unexplained. Times that didn't quite add up, lack of reaction from the victims, the strange uniformity of the scene. These elements would not be brought to court in a central way, but they were still present as background noise. The house, at that moment, remained closed, practically untouched since the last inspections. However, one last visit was authorized, not as an official part of the process, but as a final attempt to verify if anything had been overlooked. The team that went in was already familiar with the place, but the feeling was different. The investigative momentum and initial urgency were gone. The atmosphere seemed even more static, as if suspended in time. Each room carried the same dense silence, but now it seemed more evident, harder to ignore. Nothing new was found, no evidence forgotten, no concrete clues. Nevertheless, the visit was not insignificant, because it reinforced something that was already implicit. Everything that could be proven had already been found, and what remained, it couldn't be formalized. In the days leading up to the trial, Ronald exhibited unusual behavior. More reserved than before, he avoided any interaction that wasn't strictly necessary. His lawyers tried to prepare him, align his answers, and anticipate possible questions. But there was a clear limit. He cooperated up to a certain point. After that, it would close completely. In one of these sessions, when instructed to maintain a consistent narrative, he responded simply, "You want a version that makes sense." The phrase was not a refusal, but it wasn't acceptance either. It was a fact. And this made it clear that regardless of what was presented in court, there was a difference between what could be said and what had actually been experienced. This difference became the invisible center of tension. The media intensified its coverage. The case was already being treated as a landmark event, one that transcended the boundaries of a common crime. Public expectation was not only for a conviction, but for an explanation, something that would fill all the gaps. Something that would bring clarity, but internally many already knew that wouldn't happen. As the day of the trial approached, the pace quickened. Documents were finalized, testimonies organized, strategies defined. Everything was moving towards a decisive moment. And yet, there was a persistent feeling of incompleteness, as if the story were being driven towards a necessary conclusion, but not necessarily true in every respect. The climax was approaching, not just as a resolution to a case. But this is the point at which versions, interpretations, and doubts would be directly confronted, and perhaps, for the first time, something unexpected could emerge. The trial began in a heavy atmosphere, not only because of the gravity of the facts, but also because of the expectation that had accumulated over months of speculation. The courtroom was full. Journalists, curious onlookers, experts, all were waiting for something more than a simple verdict. There was a silent tension, as if everyone knew that this moment would not only conclude a case, but would define how it would be remembered. Ronald DeFeo Jr. entered the courtroom with a composed expression. He showed no obvious nervousness or resistance. He walked steadily, like someone who had already accepted the inevitability of what was to come. Still, there was something in his gaze, not despair, but distance. The prosecution began its presentation directly. Each piece of evidence was presented with precision. The weapon, the expert reports, the timeline, the inconsistencies in the testimonies. There was no room for ambiguity. The narrative constructed was clear. Ronald acted alone, consciously, motivated by internal conflicts accumulated over time. Witnesses were called. Investigators reported the details of the scene. Experts explained the observed behavior. Everything fit within a recognizable pattern. A brutal crime, but understandable within the limits of psychology and family dynamics. The defense, on the other hand, adopted a more subtle approach. It did not attempt to deny the main facts, but sought to shift the focus. It brought up Ronald's unstable behavior, his shifting narratives, his accounts of voices and altered perceptions. It argued that there was a disconnect between action and consciousness, that although he was present, his ability to control himself was compromised. The court heard, but he didn't react. Tensions rose as both sides advanced. It was a confrontation between clarity and doubt, between control and fragmentation. And then the most anticipated moment arrived. Ronald was called upon to speak. The silence that settled in was absolute. For a few seconds, he said nothing. He simply observed the surroundings, as if assessing something beyond the people present. When he finally began, his voice did not tremble. He was firm, but low. He didn't follow a predictable line of defense. He didn't present a structured defense, nor did he repeat exactly what he had said before. Instead, he spoke directly, almost disconnected from legal logic. He described the house, not as a setting, but as an experience. He spoke of nights he couldn't sleep, of the constant feeling of being watched, of specific places where the silence seemed different. He didn't try to convince anyone. He didn't ask for understanding. He simply described it. The prosecution tried to interrupt, redirect, and bring the conversation back to the realm of facts. But for a few moments, that didn't matter, because something had changed. The way he spoke wasn't chaotic. She was organized, controlled, and this created an unexpected rupture if he was able to structure that account clearly. To what extent had he truly lost control on the night of the murders? This contradiction struck at the heart of the case. The defense tried to capitalize on the moment, reinforcing the idea of psychological fragmentation. The prosecution reacted quickly, emphasizing that subsequent clarity did not negate prior intent. The court is back on track, but the impact remained. Finally, after days of arguments, testimonies, and analysis, the decision was made. Ronald DeFeo Jr. was found guilty. The ruling was firm, based on concrete evidence and the absence of proof to support any external interference. It was the expected outcome, but it wasn't simple, because even with the conviction, something remained unresolved. The official explanation solved the crime, but it did not eliminate the doubts. The climax didn't bring a single revelation that would rearrange the entire story. It brought something more subtle and perhaps more disturbing. The perception that two truths could coexist. One, documented, accepted, legally concluded. Another one, incomplete, fragmented, but impossible to ignore. Ronald left the court without resistance. No final words, just with the same distant gaze. And at that moment, the feeling was clear. The case had been closed, but the story, not yet. Ronald DeFeo Jr.'s conviction brought the formal closure that the system demanded. The case was closed, the records organized, and the official narrative took its definitive place, a brutal family crime committed by someone in full control of their actions, albeit marked by emotional instability. For the justice system, that was enough, but outside of the official documents, the story continued to reverberate. The house on Ocean Avenue, quiet and still, remained a constant source of tension. Over time, new families showed interest in the property. The below-market price made it an attractive purchase, despite its history. Eventually, it was occupied again. And for a brief period, it seemed that everything would return to normal. But the status quo did not hold. Reports began to emerge, initially discreet, almost ignored. Feelings of discomfort in certain rooms, nights interrupted by inexplicable noises, the persistent impression that something was always out of place, nothing concrete, nothing that could be proven, still enough to generate unease. These experiences were not identical to those described by Ronald, but they bore enough similarities to revive doubts that had never been fully resolved. The media, which had already turned the case into a phenomenon, returned to explore the topic. New reports, interviews, and analyses emerged, attempting to connect the dots between the crime and subsequent accounts. Experts remained divided. Some reinforced the rational explanation, pointing to the psychological impact of living in a place with a history of violence. Others maintained a more open stance, acknowledging that certain elements remained without a satisfactory explanation. Meanwhile, those directly involved went their separate ways. Researchers involved in the case took away more than just completed reports. Some maintained the conviction that everything had been explained within the possible limits. Others, however, never stopped mentally revisiting the details that didn't quite fit. These doubts were not public, but I will persist. Ronald, now far from the spotlight, remained in an environment where time seemed to dilute events without, however, erasing them. His behavior remained reserved, with few variations over the years. He did not seek to reconstruct a public narrative, nor did he try to reverse the perception of himself. He remained silent, and this silence, in a way, became part of history. The house, in turn, transcended its status as a mere setting and became a symbol, not only of what happened there, but of what was never fully understood. Its image came to represent more than just a crime. It became an intersection point between rational explanations and persistent doubts. As time passed, new residents came and went. Some experiences were reported, others were not. The line between reality and interpretation became increasingly blurred, and perhaps that was the most lasting legacy of it all. Not the crime itself, but it's impossible to completely confine it to the realm of certainties. Because even with an official conclusion, even with a final sentence, even as the years go by, there was still one question that never found a single answer. What actually happened inside that house? This question was no longer restricted to investigators nor to those directly involved. It had become collective, and like all doubt that withstands the test of time, it continued to transform itself, taking on new forms, new meanings, without ever disappearing completely. Years later, the house was still standing, seemingly identical to any other in the neighborhood. During the day, it went unnoticed. At night, however, there were still those who avoided looking directly at its windows. New residents tried to move on, ignoring the past. Some succeeded, others didn't stay for long. The case, officially closed, became part of history, but never completely a thing of the past. From time to time, someone would still mention sounds, sensations, details that were difficult to explain. Nothing proven, nothing definitive, but enough to keep a silent doubt alive. Perhaps some stories don't end when they're resolved, only when they cease to be questioned. If this story has captivated you this far, it's because something in it has stayed with you too. Now tell me, do you believe that everything can be explained solely by the human mind, or do you think there are things that go beyond what we can comprehend? Leave your opinion in the comments. I want to know what you think. And if you enjoy true stories, dark mysteries, and cases that defy logic, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss the upcoming stories that may further challenge your perception of reality. Share this video with someone who also enjoys this type of story. Because sometimes what's most frightening isn't what we know. That's what we still can't explain.